Hello. Hello. All right, so we're thinking about the stuff we wanted to cover today, and it's all over the place when I talk about the future, the past, personal stuff, but let's get right into it. At this point, what could stop the merge from happening?
Did you hear the announcement? We delayed it until 2027. It's on
2027.
No. I think realistically, what could slow down the merge? Definitely unexpected security bugs. I mean, if you wake up in some crazy high month of this year and you discover that the merge hasn't happened yet, some security bugs and the clients is probably going to be the reason. Things that cannot stop the merge. Any kind of weird minor malfeasance, like if miners try to do some last minute thing to break the merge, that'll just mean there's going to be some kind of manual fork and it'll happen faster.
What are the possible scenarios of that? And also, could you talk about the difficulty bomb?
I mean, what could miners do in principle? Miners could 51% attack around the same time as the merge. But with the way the merge is designed, it's basically designed so that the beacon chain fork choice just picks one of the forks, and so we're fine. Miners could, if they were really coordinated, kind of stage a protest and just all quit. And if they do that, then we set a particular terminal total difficulty, and so it could just make it take a really long time until we get there. But if they do something like that and it's really serious, then once again, people will just make an update that just either changes the TTD or just sets a particular hash, right? So there's always a recovery there. I mean, what else can they do? They can make fun about centralization on Twitter. I don't know. I think at this point, I mean, practically speaking, I do feel like miners have generally realized that Ethereum is going to proof of stake, and a lot of them are not just miners; they're also stakers, plenty of them are very happy to be participating in both parts of Ethereum's transition. So I'm actually not too worried, and lots of them, I'm sure, they're going to want to start mining on Ethereum Classic or Zcash or any of these other systems, and so they as an industry do have a kind of common interest even going beyond Ethereum there. So yeah, I guess not too worried about that. I mean, I don't know what else. I feel aside from the possibility of software bugs, which is exactly what we're in the process of testing to find out, it's pretty much full speed ahead.
So I think this obviously kind of touches upon just the complexity that lies in the base layer, and you kind of talked and blogged a lot about just how the layer one should be as simple as possible. Mm-hmm. What's kind of the philosophy behind that? How does that kind of now reflect on the design for the merge, and go deeper into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in Ethereum, we've been kind of moving toward this hybrid philosophy where layer one tries to be kind of very simple, or at least as simple as it realistically can be, while layer two kind of takes on the complexity burden of providing very high levels of scaling, providing privacy, providing a lot of the things that users want, right? The changes that are all kind of going in the direction of, layer one does improve somewhat, it switches to proof of stake. We added Prototank Sharding, which accounts a lot of data that the chain gets consensus on, the rollups can use, and all of these things. But the goal is still to try to add a limited number of tools that's very general purpose. Then the layer two and the application layer kind of does the rest.
And what's the design process of that? Do you actively refuse to think about adding changes to the base layer, or is that more of you only get to realize this in retrospect? How do you kind of think about that as you're planning this?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just it's not my decision, right?
So not you specifically, just
right,
as the
and I know on one of the recent Alcor devs calls, just decided to kind of not really push hard on kind of non-merge related EIPs for a while, in general, I think there's definitely been kind of more and more pushback on adding EIPs, even things like precompiles that would have easily gotten in 2 or 3 years ago, they just have a harder time justifying themselves now. which I think is healthy. Like I think it's good to kind of not keep on increasing complexity forever and kind of throwing the kitchen sink in and growing step back and think like, what do we really need? So there's definitely an attitude of like growing conservatism toward changing things. Like if I had to kind of change that formula a little bit, like I would say, like what I would want to see is not just conservatism in terms of like the size of the changes, but also like conservatism in terms of the final result. Like not just thinking about like changing a little, but also like, can we make changes toward an Ethereum of tomorrow that's simpler than the Ethereum of today? So like banning self-destruct is probably one of those examples, right? Like, I think like I do not want a world where your grandchildren wake up in some dark rainy morning in 2072, take a look at the killer AI robots outside briefly, and then ask you, but Grandpa, like why does Ethereum like just have all of this extra two-layer weird state tree structure, and why does it have half RLP and half SSZ, and like why is me creating my own node so hard? And like you have to answer, well, because we some people in 2022 kind of just basically gave up and prioritized backwards compatibility, right? Like I think there is something to like the virtue of kind of accepting short-term costs in order to achieve long-term benefits, and like obviously it's important to prioritize, and obviously you can't do everything at the same time, but like having this kind of discussion around what are things that do incur short-term costs but are going to like actually make things better, like Ethereum a better system and a simpler system with in the long term is like a discussion that I would definitely love to see more of.
So maybe this is a good time to understand how that got applied to sharding and the design and the architecture. Could you tell us about the original design, what it is now, how that happened?
Well, I think, in that case, it's a bit of a different situation, right? Because like sharding is something new, and so like the question of like minimizing complexity of the change and minimizing complexity of the final outcome, like they just end up being perfectly aligned with each other. And the design really did evolve a lot in the direction of simplifying the base layer, right? At the beginning, it's like, there was this really complicated, like, quadratic and then, like, eventually cubic sharding design, and you had committees on top of committees, and you had chains on top of chains, it got really crazy. And then eventually that simplified down to a beacon chain with a bunch of shards that were chains that had crosslinks. Eventually that simplified further, we got rid of the crosslinks, we got rid of the shards with an independent fork choice, and now we don't even have shard blocks, right? Like the dank sharding design is actually very ultra minimal, because it basically even has one proposer that just chooses all the contents for the entire block, like the entire 16 or 32 megabytes or whatever it ends up being, right? That is it definitely is still complex, right? But at the same time, it's like vastly better than what we would have had to deal with had we actually tried to properly implement any of the designs from 2017, while at the same time, also having these 5 other roadmaps of like account abstraction and proof of stake and verbal trees and all of those things, right? So I think I do think that the Ethereum kind of research community learned and has updated a lot in the direction of like proposing things that are actually implementable.
So I think the interesting thing I've noticed is that this is a very recurring theme, and it's like a great thing, which is we kind of have initial ideas, they get kind of iterated on, then they just become simpler or even better or just more efficient. Is that something that you think is because we're able to minimize the feedback loops, or is that because we just have a lot more research that's kind of being applied faster than in other industries? Like how does this why is this repetitive in a good way as a theme from your perspective?
Why is what repetitive?
Not repetitive, sorry. Why do we see this happen often, that
the designs get simplified?
Especially in how we think about scalability.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of it is like, first of all, just the quality of the research team improving. I think, the more kind of research thinks hard, the more like it actually can build things that don't require developers to work as hard. Like ultimately, development is like a bigger slog than research is, right? So I think it's you know, it's good when you can make those trade-offs and just think a little harder and make something better. The other thing is also like just the proposals keep improving because like you have the benefit of understanding, you know, versions 1 to version n of the thing when you build version n+1 of the thing. I think it's a combination of both of those two.
It's just impressive that we see that consistently happen on the research side.
Like, and then 3, obviously, it's just that like this ongoing process of like actually just like learning to value like real simplicity more.
Amazing. Well, speaking of simplification, I want to talk about 2 EIPs, and I think it'd be good to kind of have you talk about what they are first, and then let's kind of go into should or should they not be included. Let's start with 4844. What is it, and should that exist?
Sure, so EIP 4844, aka Prototank Sharding. I guess, okay, to explain that, maybe we need to start like going into dank sharding in a bit more detail, right? So dank sharding is the sharding design that is kind of the result of like this long chain of like simplifying things and throwing things out after we started from crazy chains inside of chains back in 2015. The way dank sharding works is you still have like 1 block per slot. It looks like basically just like a regular non-sharded chain, except validator nodes don't actually have to validate everything, right? Instead, validator nodes like randomly select a few pieces of every block to verify, and because of like erasure coding, data availability sampling, a bunch of like math magic, they're like, that's actually enough, right? Like it's actually enough for every validator to only verify a few randomly selected pieces of this like big 16 megabyte blobs, or I guess blob lists. Now, the problem with dank sharding though is that it does require like erasure coding and all of this stuff to actually be implemented. And so what happens before then, right? So before then, we have Prototank Sharding, which is basically it's a kind of halfway house that can happen before full dank sharding can really be rolled out. And what happens there is it's kind of like you do dank sharding without actually sharding the data, right? Basically, you introduce all of the data formats exactly as they will exist in full dank sharding. Like you introduce this concept of blobs as transactions with this extra really big piece of data that's much cheaper, but that can't be accessed directly from the EVM. You introduce KZG commitments, you introduce all the math, you introduce all the ways that interaction between the execution and consensus layer will work. You basically do all of the kind of infrastructure work, except you don't do this kind of like random sampling check. You still require everyone to just like fully download all the blobs and check them, right? So in every slot, everyone would actually have to like download and check maybe about a megabyte of data. This amount of data is still a lot. It still provides a huge amount of space for rollups. It still stands, you know, good chance of making rollups way cheaper than they are today.
Does this have any long-term effects on the state size?
Right. So on the state size, no, because these blobs are not part of the state. On the history side, EIP 4444 is another important one. This is the history expiry EIP, basically making it so that clients don't have to store really old history anymore. And this is important both to keep the disk size of an Ethereum node small, and also actually to allow Ethereum implementations to become simpler, right? Because like you don't need one implementation to be able to process all past versions of the Ethereum protocol that ever existed. You needed to be able to just like process like maybe the last 1 or 2 hard forks, and then if you really want to have a node that checks the entire history, like you can basically just download multiple versions of the client, and then like we'll have to like serially verify. Yeah, serially verify. Like we'll have to implement like some interchange format, so you can run one of them, then export the post state, import that as a pre-state into the second one, run a few more blocks, export the post state, and put it into the third and all that. Like that's all doable, and that does basically the idea is to try to allow the nodes responsible for a consensus, or allow the nodes for responsible for the really critical thing of keeping the blockchain running today to kind of be as simple as possible. And there are going to be ways of doing all the other stuff. There are already plenty of ideas on how to like create automated networks that kind of automatically start backing up all of the history and to make that really robust. So it's like basically guaranteed, with like a one of interest model that the history will be actually saved, and also like actually be able to like check and see what happened in the history, but. Like that would be a kind of somewhat more specialized functionality, and like users who care about that will be able to do it, but users who only wants to run a node to verify what's going on today would not have to concern themselves with as much with that, and they'll be able to like just process a narrower piece of the chain. So yeah, that's the AP4444.
What about 4337?
4337 is the account abstraction. I believe it's going to have a presentation tomorrow, so highly recommend people watch it. But account abstraction, this is another one of those things that I've cared about for a very long time. Like basically, it's like making smart contract wallets first-class citizens, right? So there's two kinds of accounts in Ethereum. There's what we call EOAs, externally owned accounts, which are the accounts that like most people have their coins and assets and everything in. And then there's smart contract wallets. Smart contract wallets use like smart contract code to be able to impose arbitrary conditions on when the funds can be spent, right? So you can have a multi-sig wallet where you have like say 5 different keys that might even be controlled by different people, and you need 3 of them to approve a transaction. You could have social recovery wallet where like a 3 of 5 can change the key that's needed to sign. You could replace ECDSA with a different signature scheme. You could replace it with something quantum resistant, right? Like you can do a lot of things. But the problem is that smart contract wallets today, smart contract wallets cannot initiate transactions. And so actually using one requires you to have some money in an EOA, and like you basically just needlessly complicated, and that's a big part of why not many people use it. But then EOAs, they only support like one form of authentication, which is one single private key, right? So I think, so what 4337 does is basically, it's like an extra protocol way, kind of like second layer way to make smart contract wallets basically be as convenient as EOA wallets are today. And so, regular users, it will be much easier to like actually have one of these more secure, like, multi-sig or social recovery or whatever kinds of wallets. And so, to try, like, you would actually be able to, feel safe and comfortable using Ethereum without having to worry about, like, what happens if someone hacks my computer and steals my private key, or what if my private key gets lost.
Good.
Is this just in the implementation phase, or what kind of, how do we think about that from just?
I believe like it's already on testnets. I believe ERC4337 is going to be released on the mainnet fairly soon.
That should change how most of the hackathon projects work. That's going to be awesome. You already touched upon the quality of researchers that have kind of come on in the last few years to kind of improve the protocol, but let's kind of zoom out a little bit and go into how do you think the Ethereum Foundation's role has changed in that same window, and just kind of from your perspective, what was the role now, and how do you think the role the Foundation serves?
Yeah, I think the Ethereum Foundation, first of all, like it has really stepped up on kind of improving its quality, improving its kind of organizational capacity. Like there's just a lot of things that the Ethereum Foundation was completely not capable of doing just because like it did not have people. And there'll be lots of people who would just say like, hey, like, can we do this? And like I just unfortunately would not be able to point them to people who can actually do it. And like now, all of that stuff is just so much better, right? Like, there's like excellent people in the foundation, like Stephen Gilbert, who's been doing a lot of like Latin America work, some other things. Josh Stark has been great at just organizing a whole bunch of things in the foundation core. And there's this Aya Miyaguchi, new executive director, has definitely been great, and both her work kind of organizing the foundation and a lot of the philosophy that she's introducing, I think, have been excellent. So just a lot of like really good people lately that I'm very happy about. So it's definitely a much more capable organization. It's definitely an organization more capable of starting to like have breathing room to think about the long-term big questions. Because like in 2016 and 17, like we barely had breathing room, right? Like in 2015, like we barely had money. And then because of barely having money, we barely had people. And then in 2016 and 17, we barely had enough people to do things. And like finally, you know, over the last 4 years, we've really managed to exit that kind of, you know, vicious cycle, which has been, I think, excellent.
We can actually observe it too, which is the great part. Just the last 2 years have been phenomenal, and just seeing more transparency, the level of effort going into different geographies. Just this event itself, Dev Connect, I absolutely agree.
Yay. Dev Connect!
Do you think the Ethereum Foundation should just focus on making the protocol better, or do you think this expands into supporting or collaborating with other protocol?
I mean, I think that there's definitely room for the Ethereum Foundation to get more involved at the application layer. And I also think that there's more room for everyone except the foundation to get more involved at the protocol layer, right? To some extent this has happened already, right? But like I think for the first couple of years, like we have had this kind of like interesting sort of like half decentralization where there's these like 5 different layer 2 client teams, there's
way more.
Like 5 different, not layer 2s. Consensus client teams, and there's a lot of layer 2 teams. There's a lot of execution layer teams, but like a big part of a lot of their budgets would still come from the foundation, right? And so like it sets up the structure, but the foundation is still kind of at the has this kind of very strong, very central role. But like we were already starting to see signs of that diversifying. We're already seeing signs of like actors outside of the foundation supporting all of these different teams, supporting all of these different individual developers.
And you're referring to just kind of companies in this space that are...
Like companies is one, like, you know, obviously, you know, there's Consensus, there's the various different DAOs, there's like, well, I think like Lido announced that they're supporting Protocol Guild, you know, the whole Protocol Guild effort in general. I think, you know, the whole, like the NFT for EAP 1559. And like there's, I think, a lot of potential for this to go much further. Like I think we still need to remember like that we are in a world where, I believe, is it still true that the Uniswap DAO has more capital than the foundation does?
I believe so too.
Yeah, so...
I guess what about collaboration with other layer 1s? Do you see a future where we can work with the Bitcoin community?
Oh, interesting. Yeah,
a lot of good
anything. I mean, anything can happen. I think you know, out of coming out of the COVID pandemic, you know, new century, you know, new challenges. You know, it's possibly time to make new friends. It's yeah. Well, I think you know, especially like both the Bitcoin and the Ethereum ecosystems are just kind of so different from what they were 5 years ago, and you know, they're just like clearly are, you know, do things that are somewhat similar and also somewhat different, and I think like there's a clearer sign that like, you know, actually coexistence between these two ecosystems is possible, and like I think the big thing that you need for like people to feel comfortable cooperating is like the feeling that there doesn't exist a kind of neither can live while the other survives relationship between the two, right? Because once, like people are at their most evil not out of greed but out of fear, right? Like when people perceive that, you know, if they don't like fight for their interests and for their own interests, that they're gonna like lose to some existential threat, that's when people are gonna be the most willing to sacrifice everything for their interests. You know, if the competitive part of the relationship is not an existential one, that already just like reduces the temperature so much. I mean, I think, technical collaboration is definitely possible. I mean, there's definitely some happening already. Like I think a lot, you know, the nerds generally, like they're happy to kind of like, you know, ignore the politics and just like work on really fun and cool stuff and interpolate the polynomials together, which you know, I think is great. And I think you know, more and more very possible over time.
That's great. All right, so for the next section, I'm going to call it underrated or overrated. I'm going to give you a topic. You comment on is if this is underrated or overrated, and then a short answer on why.
Sure.
So first one, 85% hot green tea, 15% red wine.
Underrated. Like only a few people have heard of it so far. We need to like spread this. We need to like make it the new thing. The current thing.
We'll try to serve that at midnight. One coin, one vote.
I mean, OneCoin is a scam. I see, like token voting governance. I think realistically, I think still overrated. Like, I've yelled a lot at it, but I feel like the yelling hasn't really yet translated into people actually seriously experimenting with alternatives.
What's a good framework for thinking about how voting or governance should work overall? It's a very broad, deep question, but specifically for the voting
system. It is. I mean, I don't think there's one framework. I think there's a few different frameworks. Like, one of them is collusion resistance, right? Like, how to prevent concentrated interests from always beating out diffuse interests, right? Like, because that's the big problem that always happens in the world. Plutocracy is actually not very good at that. Like, what other things can be? The second is how to the first one, you can think about it in two ways. Like, you can think about it in kind of like mild ways where you have like the concentrated interest is like a fairly tame actor, like, I don't know, paradigm is tame, right? And the diffuse interest is like random community members. But then on the other hand, there's like the concentrated interest is like a hostile attacker that's there was that $80 million DeFi hack, right? Like, someone tried to roll their own stablecoin.
Technically not a hack.
Yeah, right. Technically, it was a
working as intended.
It was a special cryptographic operation.
Interesting in pride.
Yeah. So basically,
special cryptographic.
Basically, what happened there was like there was this. Someone tried to roll their own stablecoin, and it had a governance token, and the governance token, had something like an $80 million market cap, and this is like lower than the value of the assets it was protecting.
That was the treasury, I believe.
Right. Well, it was the governance tokens was lower than the value of the treasury,
right.
And so someone did a flash loan, and they just borrowed 51% of the governance tokens, right?
And they voted to transfer the money to them as a governance vote, and then they flash loaned it themselves, and they got approved.
Yeah, right. So, you want to be resistant to attacks, right? That's also...
Is delay the best way of thinking about that, or?
Well, I mean, delay is like
figure out civil resistance in a
let's
different way.
really figure out civil resistance. Like, I think the delay thing can kind of, it can help in the short term. It's a band-aid. Like, if you're in my article, I think it was moving beyond coin voting governance or something like that. Like, I talk about some longer-term financial attacks that can still work no matter what the delays are. So I think it's still concerning. So there's that. So that's one framework, right? Of thinking about collusion and attack resistance. Another framework is how to ensure that the decisions are high quality, right? Like, basically, how do you ensure that the people with the governance power actually are people with expertise who actually deserve to have the governance power? Delegation is one of the answers, but delegation might not be the only answer because there's
still subject to.
Yeah, there's people who don't know and who know that they don't know, but then there's people who don't know that they don't know, right? If they're gonna just delegate to Peep the Frog number 12437, then that's also not the best.
I think we should go on to the rest of the topics.
Okay.
There's a lot more there. PFP NFTs.
PFP NFTs, I think a bit overrated, just because the problem is you can clone them, and we don't really have good infrastructure for telling clones apart from not clones, and even answering the philosophical question of when is a clone even an illegitimate clone in the first place, and when is it just Yo-Dog that's part of the game.
Public goods funding.
Still one of the most important problems in the world, so probably still underrated.
Actually, I have way more questions, so I won't dig into it. RLP.
It's still part of the Ethereum protocol, so it's overrated.
Plato art.
Plato art, like the philosopher?
Play to earn.
Oh, play to earn. Oh, I see it.
We can do that one.
Art of the Greek philosopher. I definitely would want to see some more NFTs.
Plato art, yes.
Would you have Plato art as your PFP?
Maybe.
Okay, yeah, play to earn. I think probably a bit overrated. I think The problem that I see with it is that like I haven't yet seen a credible story about like who would actually be the one that's like providing the capital that people end up earning by playing.
Is that an argument for just not having enough time passed, or you just mean it's an economically?
It's just an economic thing. Like if you have token outflow, you have to have token inflow. Who's going to pay for the inflow?
L2 centralization.
Like centralization of layer 2 protocols?
Winner-take-all effects in L2s.
Oh, well, I guess like you have to be clear about what you mean, right? Because like one of them is like, oh, you know, what if like fuel gets 95% of the market share, but fuel like becomes super decentralized, and then basically you have like this, you know, weird kind of awkward two-layer Ethereum. But then the other one is like, well, what if there's like 5 different rollups, but the sequencers are all run by one guy? I mean, the good news about layer 2s is like those are, like even the worst outcomes are not as like actually necessarily that bad, right? Because you still have trustlessness, as long as the L2s are designed correctly, you still have censorship resistance. Probably the biggest risk is like governance capture. Like what if the L2 has governance and it does a governance vote and there's too much network effects for people to like actually be willing to exit if the governance like turns it into something trusted, for example?
Are you worried about that influencing layer 1 design in a way that you would not intend, or just like how does that?
L2s influencing layer 1 design? I mean, possible. Like, I mean, I definitely do think that like application layers, like things
it's not necessarily always
influencing governance. Like it's not just an L2 problem. Like it's something that could happen in like so many different ways, right? Like there's going to be a lot of conflicts of interest between different kinds of applications on Ethereum, right? I mean, you could go like all the way dystopian and like, oh, you know, is there going to be like some major, you know, a centralized stablecoin that starts lobbying for the base layer to have KYC, which, you know, like, I feel like that one is like a bit too blatant, and I think too many people would just like resist that one very quickly, but you know, there's all kinds of things like that. So I think the answer isn't so much worrying about like one specific interest as it is about making sure that the governance as a whole is like secure against like those kinds of like social attacks from all possible concentrated interests.
Last one. Private keys, underrated or overrated?
Oh, underrated. I mean, you know, the EU is like freaking trying to ban people from having their own personal wallets. Like, come on. Yeah, I think like personal wallets where like you actually control your private key, or it's a social recovery or multi-sig wallet and your family controls some of the keys. Like that kind of like cyber self-sovereignty is, I think, like a really important bedrock of having a decentralized crypto ecosystem.
Even with account abstraction?
Even with account abstraction, yes. Like I think like smart contract wallets are not about giving up control. They're about like being able to actually choose who to trust, who we can recover, and like these things don't like. Even like multi-sig wallets and social recovery does not have to mean centralization. Like you know, as I said, like you can choose 5 different friends who don't know each other and have them be your recovery guardians. Like I actually recommend this, right? So there's a lot that you can do with that. But like anything like that is far better than an ecosystem where like almost all users like just interact with the blockchain through a centralized provider where they don't actually control their own access.
Yeah, I think permissionless needs to be truly permissionless. How were the last 2 years for you with COVID and everything?
Oh, it's been, I mean, it's definitely, like the kind of mandatory break of my usual schedule was definitely kind of like interesting and fascinating, in that, like before COVID, I was basically on a plane on average once every 6 days. Like, you know, like I literally have like tracking, and like that was my life between about 2014 and 2019, and that obviously had to, you know, cut down completely. I was basically, you know, holed up in Singapore for about you know, most of a year in the middle of that, and I ended up walking to every district in Singapore. You know, it's a nice small city-state, 700 and I think 18 or something square kilometers. That's I think like was it somewhere around like 300 freedom units, a bit less, but. Yeah, you know, in Singapore's nice. Like you can actually do like literal cross-country running there, but yeah, so it was also just you know, a good opportunity to kind of like think about things, just like get quiet work done. But at the same time, also definitely a lot of inconveniences and like a lot of serious stuff that I would have rather not had. Like there were definitely family members that I was just not able to see for a whole year, which I think was really unfortunate, and definitely I think.
Did you pick up any new hobbies?
Did I pick up any new hobbies? I listened to a lot of podcasts. That was.
Any favorites that you want to recommend?
Hardcore History was a fun one. Lex Friedman's a lot of them are very good. There's also Lex Friedman's about history, and there's Lex Friedman with the guy who does Hardcore History.
It's like possibility in action.
You can like go meta on this quite a bit. Since then it's like I think definitely it's so nice to actually be able to also see people in person and see all of the old friends again that I've missed for such a long time.
And that's one of the really interesting pieces for us today too. There's hundreds of people that have participated at the Youth Global events for the last 2 years, which we've never met, and seeing so many of them come to us and say hi, and us knowing that, including some of the global employees and team members, we've never seen them until now, and it's awesome to see that. So I'm really glad to hear that. Today is the 22nd of April. How was your 420?
Oh, let's see. Yeah, 420 is an important day because 420 is it's the smallest number which is divisible by all the integers from 1 to 7. It's also the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. Very meaningful number. Anyway, what did I do? I went to a mini internal Ethereum Foundation research workshop and listened to Mary Maurer do an excellent job explaining a single secret leader election.
Sounds awesome. We've talked enough about the past leads to the merge. Let's talk about ETH3. What's coming? What are some interesting problems? And what's something exciting that we can share here?
Well, remember, there is no ETH2 and there's definitely no ETH3. There is the merge, the surge, the verge, the purge, and the splurge. The merge we know is completing the switch to proof of stake. The surge, massive increase in scaling because of layer 2s and sharding. We talked about Dank sharding, a lot of progress on layer 2s here. That's something that we've really seen kind of become alive over the last year or so, right? Like we've basically gone from, Starknet and Optimism and Arbitrum and most of these kind of being theoretical to really being live. Some of them have been around for much longer than a year, right? But it does really feel like the last year has been this amazing and huge tipping point. The surge, really getting kind of the scalability vision kind of fully complete. It is progressing, right? I think very recently Optimism added in support for compression, and that noticeably decreased transaction fees by I think another somewhere between 25 and 40%. Yeah, this thing. Yeah.
Almost half.
Yeah, so that's amazing, and there are going to be more and more of these, right? Eventually, replace ECDSA with something else, and that can add a lot more compression. Eventually, Prototank Sharding a lot more, and then full Dank Sharding a lot more. So I think we're going to see transaction fees on rollups continue taking steps further and further down over the next couple of years, and that'll be amazing. The Verge, this is the switch to Verkle trees. And Verkle trees are important because they enable stateless clients, which basically means you can verify the chain basically without having anything in your hard drive. You can just verify any random individual block you want without having pre-existing information about what happened in the previous block. And that's really important, right? Basically because it makes it much easier to run a validator. It's very good for proof of stake decentralization. It also means that we don't have to worry about the size of the state for a long time. There's all these concerns about, are we going to implement state rents, and do we have to do that? What happens when the state blows up to a terabyte? But if you have proposer-builder separation, so we can allow block building to become a more specialized market, while validators don't even have to run any state at all, they just verify stateless blocks, then even the state being a terabyte in size is actually manageable, right? So Verge is going to do a lot of good things. Then there is the Purge. And the purge is like basically like eliminating cruft. So we talked about EIP 4444, nodes not having to store history anymore. There's like the very long-term vision of eventually doing state expiry. So eventually we can also like allow even builders to not store old state. Then there is just allowing and making it a norm for Ethereum clients to not have to process and like be able to understand every single previous version of the protocol is also part of the purge. Simplifying the Ethereum protocol, so banning self-destruct, maybe like getting rid of and replacing the 2300 gas stipend, like maybe getting rid of and replacing logs because like, do we really need in-protocol Bloom filters when like basically no one uses that infrastructure and everyone is using the graph anyway, right? Like at
archive nodes will...
Exactly, like at some point, I think you do have to sort of ask that question. What other things are there? There's, just like a lot of simplifications in the Ethereum protocol that I think can be made and that I think should be made, and like the purge is all of that. And then the splurge is like basically all of the other cool stuff, right? So account abstraction is really big, important. Proposer-builder separation is really important. And there's this kind of like adding VDFs to increase the security of node validator set is also really important. So a lot of really nice things. Also there is, I guess you could put this in the merge bucket because it's also proof of stake, but this longer term idea of moving to single slot finality. So instead of blocks finalizing after 2.5 epochs, blocks finalize like immediately in the next slot. And this has like a bunch of important benefits. There's a bunch of technical reasons why actually it might be easier than we thought. And like, over the last like year or so, we've discovered that there are a lot of like just inherent complexities that are difficult to work around.
How do you think about reorgs in that world? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so the point is that reorgs do not exist unless you're in the special case where like a large portion of nodes are offline and so you're not finalizing. If most of the nodes are online, then you're finalizing, so you can't have reorgs. That's like the big benefit. Right, so like the thing that we realized over the last year is that there actually are a lot of like unavoidable complexities and like room for bugs in the way that we combine fork choice rules and finality today. And so moving to single slot just like reduces the number of protocols from 2 to 1, and it just makes things so much simpler potentially.
That'd be huge. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I'm done from there.
Okay. Final question. We've been part of Ethereum for the last 7 years. The Bitcoin and just the cryptocurrency ecosystem is around for a little over a decade. How has that evolved from your perspective, the space, whether we're talking about the research or the community or just overall the blockchain space? Give us like what the last 5 to 10 years have been, and how do you see this moving forward for the next 5 to 10 years?
I think the crypto space today is just like so different from what it was like 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. Like there's aspects of the old space that I really miss. Like I definitely miss like how it was this kind of like very small and niche thing that like most people didn't really know about, and even people who did know about it kind of thought that it was a sideshow.
As an anecdote, our last event was ETH London 2 years and like a month ago. And we were struggling to make that a full house, and that capacity was 300 people. So.
Exactly, yeah. And there were definitely these kind of like very mysterious and undiscovered aspects of it, like even like visiting China and like discovering this kind of like dark forest of like various 16-year-olds who have actually been mining Bitcoin for 4 years, ended up already being multimillionaires and quitting high school. There's just like a lot of libertarians and socialists peacefully arguing with each other on Bitcoin Talk and like having like actually fascinating highbrow conversations. Sometime around this time, I think, is like the 10th anniversary of like either the Pirate at 40 hack or Bitcoinica, or maybe both, like I forget. Who here remembers Pirate at 40? Wow. Who here remembers Bitcoinica? Zotong, who was,
give us a little bit of background.
I think it was like the first like Bitcoin leverage trading platform. It ended up just getting hacked over and over again, and eventually it just didn't have any money, and lots of people got angry. And Pirate at 40 was an anonymous guy running basically like a fund, which was like a way of investing in like some Bitcoin related stuff and getting like some, like I think it was like 7% weekly profits. You know, and the guy basically said like, hey, you know, trust me. And a bunch of people did trust him. You know, what Mark Zuckerberg said 20 years ago about people who trust him. This guy was anonymous, so it was, he basically just like ended up just like, oh no, he actually did get caught and he did go to jail eventually. You know, there's like such crazy stuff happened back then. I mean, I guess, you know, these days you like, we have like different versions of that. Like we don't have that, like that sort of stuff.
Severity has been slightly
minimized. Well, I mean, it's like the sizes, like the dollar amounts of crazy stuff that happens are, I think, about the same, but like as they have been all along. But like as a percentage of the ecosystem, it's definitely much smaller. And I definitely think that's good, right? So it's definitely good that the ecosystem has matured, you know, it's definitely grown a lot. People understand a lot, like what actually can be done, what can't be done, you know, how, like what kinds of things make sense in terms of scalability, in terms of privacy, in terms of all of these issues. So I think, you know, over the next 5 to 10 years, like, we're going to see, you know, the continuation of that process, and we're going to see, like, you know, like a lot of crypto applications continue to turn into something that's like really mainstream. You know, I think there are going to be some costs to that. Like, I think, like the aspect of, you know, the crypto space being this frontier, I don't think that's going to go away. Like, I think the crypto is just like so hard to control that there's always going to be a frontier within crypto, but like it's not going to be the case that like all of crypto is a frontier anymore, right? But at the same time, you know, it's hopefully going to be something that like just lots of people use as a regular part of their lives.
Yeah, that's a good future. Before we end, any predictions for what the next few years look like?
The Ethereum price will be 12,000, but I won't tell you in what currency. Could be bolivars, Venezuelan. And it could be, or it could be Doge.
You won't tell us what currency or what base.
Exactly, yes. And I won't tell you if that's 1,000 in base 10 or base 3. What are the predictions? I mean, basically I think, you know, scaling and zero knowledge and smart contract wallets and all that stuff are going to be mature, and you know, the ecosystem will then have to like basically either succeed on its ability to actually deliver on the applications that people have been expecting for so long, or it'll not do that, or something in the middle. I mean, I do think that like blockchains have already proven that they are here to stay and that they do have some value, but there is still this question of like, well, you know, in what places, exactly how much? Like, you know, are we talking like the new Windows of finance, or are we talking the Linux of finance, and not just for finance? Like, well, how does that end up like playing out in every other industry? So no, I mean, it's still you know, a lot of things that remain open and undecided. But you know, I think you know, all of the lovely you know, hackers at the hackathon here can you know, do a lot to try to kind of help make the more positive outcomes happen.
It's a perfect note to end this on. Thank you so much, and let's give a big round of applause.